Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's World Affairs program. My name is Hayde Adams. I'm a television journalist and a news anchor for the Voice of America's Straight Talk Africa discussion program. World Affairs is a San Francisco-based nonprofit, nonpartisan forum that explores international issues and ideas beyond borders in all their interest and complexity. And as you all might remember, Monday, July 18th, was International Mandela Day in recognition of the contributions of perhaps South Africa's most famous figure, Nelson Mandela. And this is a day which hopes to inspire worldwide action to improve our communities everywhere. Today, World Affairs is thrilled to bring you a conversation with Evan Lieberman. He's a total professor of political science and contemporary Africa at MIT. His newly published book, Until We Have Won Our Liberty, South Africa After Apartheid, explores the messy development of democracy in Africa's most industrialized nation and one of the most unequal countries yet. And this book offers hope for the enduring impact of democratic ideals. Just a note, if you, our audience, have a question, you can ask it in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll do our best, of course, to answer your question at the end of our program. Evan Lieberman, welcome to World Affairs.
Thanks, it's great to be here, Hayde.
So I want to get right into it, but maybe perhaps before I do, just so folks know where I'm coming from, I am from South Africa. I was born and raised in South Africa, and I came of age at the time that democracy dawned in the country. I grew up under the system of apartheid, and I finished high school in 1994 when everything in the country was opening up and opportunity was everywhere. The country, there was great excitement. I don't think any of us who lived through those times will ever forget what South Africa felt like during that time. The 90s were fantastic years, at least because we had won our political freedom. And many of us, like me, we were not born in freedom. And this was truly a momentous moment for us. But of course, as Evan writes in his book, democracy is messy and it is not a destination. You have to work at it. And the greatest challenge perhaps for South Africa was not just winning political freedom, but to manage our democracy. And those are some of the themes we're going to explore with Evan, who writes so brilliantly about this. And Evan, I want you to start out with you and your fascination with South Africa. What drew you to the country? I mean, of all the countries in all the world that you could have shown interest in, why South Africa, this country at the southernmost tip of Africa?
Thanks, Hayde. You know, it's amazing to me how long I've been interested in South Africa. You know, I was a teenager growing up in New York City in the 1980s and started learning about this apartheid system, you know, and as a young person, you like to understand things that involve some moral clarity. And, you know, apartheid South Africa, this system of white government, and a white government that was really oppressing the Black majority, was just, you know, a clear and obvious, you know, moral wrong. And there was so much activism around the country, and, you know, you couldn't, it was hard to be a young person and not get caught up in that. But then when I went to college, to university in the early 1990s, I was lucky enough in 1991, just 1 year after Mandela was released from prison, after being in prison for 27 years, to take a class about the end of apartheid and what were the options ahead. And then I had this opportunity, this amazing opportunity to travel there for 6 weeks in the summer of 1991. And, you know, the moral clarity of my earlier years gave rise to a fascination about the complications of the reality, combined with an absolutely beautiful country, you know. And so as a person growing up in the United States at the time, I could see parallels, but this was a whole, you know, new beginning, and it just filled me with interest and excitement. And then I wound up, you know, pursuing it in my graduate studies and lots of other projects, culminating in this recent book.
Right. And I want to ask you about that. What did you hope to accomplish with this book? As someone who comes from outside, who comes from one of the most, probably the most famous democracies in the world, what did you want the world to understand or know about South Africa? And who was your audience for this book?
Well, the South Africans themselves are very thoughtful, very reflective, write a lot about South Africa, and surely know more about South Africa than I do as an outsider. But I felt that I could bring a kind of informed outsider's perspective as someone who has followed this country for a long time, and that would be valuable because I had some distance. But importantly, over the years, certainly in recent years, I could read my own newspaper, see on TV, the only news that came out of South Africa was very, very bad news. So much so that when I would, tell people, oh, I'm going on a trip to South Africa, they say, oh, that place is really falling apart, isn't it? And I'd say, well, it's got its problems, but it is not this disaster. The one news story that you saw, last week does not define what this country is all about. And for me, watching this progression over time, I felt that there was a bigger picture that needed to be shared, and that we were kind of losing the forest for the trees.
Evan, I as a South African, I found it very refreshing to read sort of an outsider's perspective, because South Africans are often criticized for being perhaps a little too inward looking. The Africans who are always so preoccupied with their own country, their own politics. But you take us on a very interesting journey, and actually to a place in South Africa that coming from Cape Town, I'm not very familiar with this place. So I learned a lot reading what you had written, and you start out in a place called Krugersdorp, and this is in Mohali City, and you compare it to the American Wild West, and you're correct, because Krugersdorp is a mining town that exists because of the gold rush in that part of the country in the 1800s. Why did you decide to start out in that very complex part of the country?
Well, first, it was somewhat selfish in that I wanted to go study a new place in South Africa. I'd spent a lot of time in the major metropolitan areas. I knew a lot of people. I'd studied, similar dynamics over many years, and I had formulated some opinions about how the country was. So I certainly had a thesis, which was, hey, this democracy has been more successful than it's been characterized. But I kind of wanted to test that in a new place. And not necessarily in a big city, but in a smaller, manageable microcosm. And so, I spent a lot of time analyzing some data, thinking about what are these different places. And I wanted to find a kind of mid-sized municipality that had a history that embodied the larger South African story. And Mohali City in many ways was just that. I mean, no place is a perfect representation of the rest of the country. But this place centered in this mining town of Krugersdorp, which was formulated as a result of the major gold rush, the end of the 1800s, and it was a crazy, wild mining town where people from around the world came seeking, opportunities to make quick profits, just like we had in the west of the United States. And this was at a time before the country of South Africa, the Union of South Africa, was formed. It was still very much divided into different distinct political entities. And there was a great war that happened between English and Afrikaners, two different white groups. So the major battle was between white groups at that time, around the turn of the 19th century. But then when that was settled in the early part of the 19th century, it was still, this really interesting divided town where there were a lot of Black workers coming in to work the mines, and already the beginnings of this institutionalization of white supremacy, of keeping Blacks out of that town, and they had to stay in certain, reserved areas. And so segregation started. And so I thought, this really interesting history, let's look at this over time. Because if I want to understand, well, what has it been like in these past 25 years, we should compare it to what came before. And so you have to take a bet when you do research, and it was a bet that paid off, I think, because it turned out to be just a fascinating place to study.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And what I also like about how you set the scene, you really take the reader smack bang into the heat of the fight, this fight over opportunity ahead of an election. And you take us into the heart of South Africa's electoral politics. Tell us a little bit about that scene, about the protests.
Yeah, so I opened up the book, quite honestly, the very first day that I was scheduled to conduct research in this area, months in the making from, my offices in Cambridge. I fly into Johannesburg. I, through friends, find a potential research assistant who's going to work in this area, who's from the Black area of Kagiso. And she says, well, why don't you meet me down in downtown Krugersdorp at this fast food restaurant, the Chicken Licken. And so I say, great, I'll be able to find that. I go and I park there, and literally within just a few minutes, as I talk about in the opening of the book, people are leaving their tables. They're going to the entrance of the restaurant. The shutters of the windows are coming down, and there's a massive protest of thousands of people coming from the almost entirely Black township of Muncieville, which is a few miles or kilometers away. And they're protesting in a manner that was very reminiscent of the apartheid era protests, right? Dancing this dance called the Toi Toi, which is a militaristic protest, which all South Africans are familiar with, that involves certain singing and chanting. And yet that style of protest, to protest white government, was being used to protest this Black-run ANC government. Now, it wasn't a surprise to me that a protest would happen, because these protests have been going on for years in South Africa. It was a little more surprising to me that this happened within 5 minutes of my arriving in Krugersdorp. But it was putting the spotlight right away on the problem, which was that just about 25 years after the election of Nelson Mandela and all of the hopes and dreams, there were all of these organized protests saying, we're not satisfied. You promised us a better life. And particularly in informal areas where people aren't living in formal structured homes, they are not receiving the kinds of basic services that allow one to live a dignified life. And they were prepared to basically say to the mayor, we're going to boycott these elections. And the national elections were coming up in May. But when I was there, it was the time of voter registration. And, as we know, that we're a bunch of Black voters, and we're going to damage the ANC's vote and that's going to look bad for you, Mr. Mayor, if you're not able to deliver for the party. And so that in many ways is a touchstone for understanding the dynamics of contemporary South African politics, which is, it's still the case that this Liberation Party, the African National Congress, or ANC, which is over a century in the making, which formed from the early days and from 1912 and protest of a white government that got formed, that then became the leaders of this new democracy. That they're still in charge, but a lot of their constituents are unhappy. And so the tour I take you on in those first couple of chapters is both to learn about what the issues, that the things that people are really unhappy about and say that they're unhappy about, and then to understand the different options that people have. And unlike in American politics, where we really have a kind of two-party system, they're more than that. They have this, a political system in South Africa that allows for more feasible options. And so I wanted to I won't necessarily go through all those parties right now, but to say that those were those concerns about how are we going to deal with basic services, how are we going to achieve the dreams that we were promised, and particularly for this Black majority that really their dignity was denied during this very long period of white rule.
And a lot of it is about unkept promises, right? If you think of what people have to contend with today, the government's seemingly inability to deliver basic services to the majority of the country. And this takes me to another passage you wrote about, because I want people to get a clear idea of what the legacy of apartheid that we always talk about. South Africans talk about it ad nauseum, but it is a real thing in South African society. And I'm glad that you touched on it. You say on page 53 of your book, you write, apartheid, or apartness, was a full-blown system of social engineering relentlessly implemented on the southern tip of the African continent. It effectively relegated a Black majority to third-class citizenship. And you go on to say, apartheid came to symbolize the essence of injustice, a retrograde form of internal colonial rule. And, as you know, we say today, slavery around the world was abolished, but it didn't really end. You still find it in society today. Same in South Africa, apartheid was abolished, but the ghost of apartheid still haunts the country. And I'm sure you saw that in almost every aspect of society. What did that legacy look like, or does it look like to you as a non-South African?
It's quite profound. I mean, I just had a graduate student who traveled to South Africa for the first time, and I was debriefing with her, and she said, "Wow, I just wasn't prepared for how segregated the country was going to be," and that's exactly right. So there was this system. I mean, since the Europeans arrived in the southern African part of the southern part of the continent in the mid 17th century, there were various forms of white rule and white domination. There was never really equal citizenship or practice in the various parts of the country in which whites colonized and settled, and that was commensurate with the way in which Europeans dealt with Africa and what we had in the United States, and many parts of the world. So in some ways, Southern Africa wasn't very different from a lot of other parts of the world in those in those earlier centuries. But it was really after the middle of the 20th century, after the 1948 election, when this, really just crazy scheme called apartheid, which was meant to sound in some ways benign, right? Because it just means apartness. And it was sold by white leaders as, hey, different people should rule over themselves, right? There should be national self-determination. And most of us today would say, yeah, there should be national self-determination. That's a good thing. Peoples want to rule over themselves. But in this case, the white government was saying, and we're going to basically tell all of these Black African groups of different languages how they're going to nationally self-determine, and they're going to be in these very small plots of land, and they're going to form separate governments. We're going to keep the majority of this, white, this land, the best land for ourselves, for the white minority. But we know that we need to have a lot of Black and other non-white laborers to help work our mines, work our growing industries, and so in order to make that work for us, we're going to keep them in separate areas, these townships. We're not going to allow them to be in white areas. They're going to be in different schools. We're not going to allow people to intermarry or to have children across the color bar. And so everything, so many laws, as you well know, were created to enforce the human tendency to intermix, to go against that. So when you think about that, for how long this was implemented, and quite ruthlessly, and in an area like Mohali City, where the white minority there really embraced this ideology in ways that wasn't the case for all white South Africans, but certainly in this area they really embraced it. From that perspective, you say, wow, okay, maybe it's not so surprising that this legacy holds on. But when you go look around at, if you're in an area, residential area where there are relatively, nice houses that are familiar to, an American or a European suburb, you can almost be, sure that it's almost all white residents. And when you go out into areas where there's either very, very simple, kind of cement brick houses or shacks and tents, It's virtually all people of color. Now, obviously, what's changed, as you know, is that there has been in 25 years, now almost 30 years, some intermixing, right? So it's not a complete division in this way, and I think that's part of the exciting transformation. But much like in the United States, right? I mean, the United States, our kind of end of apartheid movement, which is the civil rights movement, and the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s, you would think that we would be much further along, right? We had more time. We had, we were talking about an African American minority, and yet America is so segregated. But South Africa is really quite profoundly so, and not just in cities. When one goes to certain rural areas, they can be quite poor and virtually all Black. It is worth remembering that today the white minority is less than 10% of the population, but they are a profoundly important minority because they continue to possess the economic and land wealth of the country.
Right, and that helps one understand, and you lay it out so beautifully in South Africa, how some can endure this just enormous economic prosperity, and how at the same time others are made to endure unimaginable economic and social hardship. And to really understand that, one has to go back and really get a picture of what exactly the apartheid government had built. And in chapter 4, you write about apartheid era economics. You say successive white governments throughout the 20th century managed to build a highly effective state. This was by no means a backward country, economically speaking, for the white population. And you say the South African government developed one of the most progressive, efficient tax systems, in which in turn contributed to the government's ability to maintain order, project power, and largely wipe out white poverty. GDP growth between 1960 and 1970 ranged from 4 to 8%. That was faster than in the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. And if the goal was prosperity for whites, apartheid was extremely successful. And I'm so happy you wrote about this, because I wonder sometimes whether the wider world realizes just how elaborate a power system the apartheid was, and what we were dealing with here, and that this was a country that was essentially built for minority rule.
Yeah, it's hard not to be impressed by what was accomplished. Right, and those legacies are there for good and for bad today, right? Many people, including myself, when I visited there in 1991 for the first time, I thought, I'm going to Africa. It was my first time to Africa. Americans, including myself, have all sorts of imaginings of what that might be. And then you're like, whoa, there are incredible airports here. The road systems look a lot better in some parts of the country than anything we have in the United States. And there is quite a bit of infrastructure in these white areas. And alongside that, the white government built an incredible security apparatus that it was able to, as a, population-wise, the white population is quite small, but was able to project power to resist, Southern African neighbors who, were collaborating in the fight against apartheid, and then internally to control the majority of the population through, a quite repressive police force, and just overall security apparatus. So now it's not to say that all Black Africans under apartheid were, it wasn't slavery. They weren't, people weren't beaten on a daily basis everywhere. People lived their lives. Black Africans, colored people, Indian people, these are these other population, race groups, as you know, in South Africa, who are also, afforded a second-class citizen relative to whites. People worked as teachers, worked as nurses, and sometimes as entrepreneurs, but they all did so in a very circumscribed way, because the white government said, we're going to protect education. We're going to have this world-class education system, but for the most part, we're going to exclude all people of color. We're going to have these great cities and towns and opportunities for fantastic lifestyle, but it's going to be reserved for whites only. And I mean, and that takes it takes a lot of effort to keep out, a majority of the population. But they did it. And that obviously generated extraordinary frustration and resentment, so much that it bubbled over to the whole world. That as a teenager in New York City in the mid 1980s, I could sense that, and I wasn't looking for it. We could see, anyone could see plain as, daylight, that this was just an unjust system, but it was one that was, being enforced quite vigorously.
And unsustainable at that, but they were successful for a very, very long time. I want to move, you take us back to the post-apartheid era. Now, South Africa under Black rule and sort of battling with this idea of creating prosperity for everyone in the country. And of course, for the African National Congress, the redistribution of land, the nationalization of mines was central to their agenda at the outset. And you write about how the ANC consulted various economists around the country, around the world, looking for, sort of examples of economic models to emulate. But then you had the white business leaders, they wanted to avert this idea of nationalization. And they made the argument that the liberation government should not, quote, as you say, kill the goose that lays the golden egg. I've heard this question raised about the ANC leadership at the time. How did a bunch of liberation activists go into prison and into exile with a communist or sort of socialist ideology, but then when they took over, governed as free market capitalists who, who felt the country could grow itself out of inequality? They didn't want capital flight. They didn't want the infrastructure of the country to grind to a halt, or immediately get rid of the people who knew how to run things. What the ANC wanted, what Nelson Mandela wanted, was to benefit from that economic infrastructure that you talked about, instead of having people just simply labor in it, right?
Yeah, it was a difficult dilemma. And I think one other important point to make was this transition was taking place in the early 1990s, right? The Soviet Union had just collapsed. So much of the ideology that had fueled, the kind of socialist ideology that was central to the African National Congress and a lot of the liberation movements was called into increasing question as being, maybe this is not something that's going to fly more generally. And it was the case that South Africa in the early 1990s, as it still is, was not a poor African country. It was, on average, an upper middle income country, and it had all this industrial infrastructure. And so it posed an exciting possibility. How do you take this and allow everyone in South Africa to benefit from what had come out, even if it was this is what I meant, is that even from an ill-begotten gain. Well, it was there, right? There are other countries that have mining resources, or that have, that had gold, that had diamonds, and that made a mess of it. But the South African government, perhaps it was ill-begotten in some ways, but that infrastructure was developed. So, it was a difficult negotiation. I think it's easy with 2020 hindsight to look back and wonder what could have been different. And I think lots of people today are a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, angry and frustrated that too much was given away. But I think if we go back to the moment, and you think about what it was like for these, political leaders of the ANC who'd been in prison, someone like Mandela, want to finally realize this peace agreement. And I think that there were credible threats of, white capital flight and who is going to run these companies, and how do we kind of peacefully negotiate what the future is going to look like. So they did. I think that today we see, an amazing degree of inequality that's been perpetuated, perhaps in part owing to the fact that a better deal wasn't struck. But the flip side being, there aren't really great cases around the world where mass nationalization of assets has turned into a productive economic outcome for everyone, right? And if we look at other parts of the world, including in Africa, where there has been mass nationalization, sadly, that the imperative to try to provide for everybody has ended up being kind of providing nothing for everybody.
And we had Zimbabwe right next door, especially with the land redistribution project they were busy with. And that sort of served as a lesson for South Africa about perhaps what not to do. But even today, there is criticism amongst some Black South Africans, especially those of a younger, newer generation, about those negotiations and what Mandela gave away, the deals he struck, the bargains he made with the Afrikaner government. And many believe that Mandela sold them out, that he essentially allowed white South Africans to make off with their ill-gotten gains. In your view, which parts of those bets or those deals paid off and which parts did not?
Well, again, one can look at the United States today, and we similarly face unbelievable, inequality, and much of it is race-based. I think that it's easy to look back and say, Mandela sold us out. It may be easier as an outsider and as an American to not be quite as critical. For me, I look at the dilemma that Mandela faced, which was he was in the midst of a civil war. There was mass violence going on in the country. There was, white Afrikaners who had, significant, caches of arms and were using them. Black South Africans were committing violence, against one another. The country was very much up in arms. And from that perspective, one has to ask, how do you strike a deal with some give and take in which we can build a better future? Now, I think one of the things that they didn't do, they probably didn't tax assets and wealth high enough. I think there was a moment at the moment of that transition when there was this honeymoon period in the country when I think white South Africans really felt a sense of responsibility and a sense of obligation. And I don't think that Mandela and the ANC took enough advantage of that moment. And I think perhaps the bigger problem is that the race-based redistribution that has taken place in the country, and it's still the case, has really enriched a small minority of Black Africans, and one of them being the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who himself is a multi-millionaire, and that wealth has not been distributed more widely. So I think those are how the process has unfolded over time is really more to blame than the initial bargains that were struck, in my opinion.
I just one more on Nelson Mandela, as a leader, how he led the country. He was this great statesman, respected and admired inside the country, in Africa, around the world. But there was this other picture emerging at home, as you just referenced. But you write that Mandela, quote, in becoming president, you say, did not offer a good test for democracy. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, he was such a charismatic leader. And by charismatic, I mean it in the sense that his own personal story of having spent 27 years in prison, of having coming out of jail and having befriended those who had imprisoned him, of all that he did, of what was iconically portrayed in the movie Invictus, where he was willing to don the jersey of the Springboks, which was thought of as this white South African team that Black South Africans would always cheer for any team that played against the Springboks. He was willing to say, you know what, I'm in it to try to make peace, and for that, people were willing to do as he said. And the problem of political order in a highly unequal, divided society is how do you get everyone to cooperate, right? Democracy requires a give and take, and it's particularly challenging given the inequality and legacies of a place like South Africa. And again, we're feeling that in the United States today. But for Americans who think we have an unequal and divided society, as you know well, South Africa has got the US beat on those scores. So how do you govern? How do you get people to agree to policies? And ultimately for Mandela, at least for most of his term, when it required some sacrifices, whether it was for white business people, whether it was asking Black Africans to be patient with service delivery, people would say, well, Madiba asked us to do this, right? And Madiba being the kind of affectionate name for Nelson Mandela, and people would say, okay, but that's not a test of democracy. That showed the charisma and importance of one person. It's when you have to elect more ordinary mortals, which is what most politicians are, just all too mortal in terms of their own vanity, self-interest, and needing to horse trade. That's when we really get to see what democratic politics is all about.
I remember when Nelson Mandela died, and of course he did not hold on to power. He stepped down, he handed over the reins, but when he passed away, there was a real sense of uncertainty of where we were going to go as a nation. I was already living in the United States at the time, so I wasn't at home experiencing that, but the sense of uncertainty about where do we go next without Nelson Mandela as being sort of the North Star for the country. Evan, South Africa is almost always in the global headlines. Today, it's about power cuts and mass shootings, inflation, crippling businesses and just everyday life, high unemployment, high crime rates. Are the same forces threatening democracy everywhere? Because many other countries in the world have some of these same problems. So in your view, are the same forces threatening democracy everywhere, threatening democracy in South Africa?
So, we haven't had a chance for me to kind of share my punchline, which I want to start with here, which is to say, I think that overall this democratic project has been pretty successful in South Africa, and I do want to put that out there because I think it's important, because there are all these problems and we're talking about them, and they're real problems that millions of South Africans face. But yes, I think that it's a combination of distinct historical legacies that are purely South African in origin, some which rhyme with the legacies of other places in the world, certainly like the United States. But then there are a few things that are truly global. One is it's really hard to solve the problem of inequality because we live in a global economy in which the returns on capital are high, in which the opportunities for people who don't have, a lot of technical skills are low. And there's so many different ways in which the global economy just offers, magnified returns for those at the top of the economic ladder. So when we look at inequality trends, around the world, they've gotten much worse. And South Africa, started off as being, certainly the most, or one of the, three most unequal places on the planet by some measures. And it's continued in that way because wealthy South Africans have gotten wealthier, and for poor South Africans, it's harder because, there's not the same manufacturing base and the same opportunities. But there are other things afoot that have changed that, again, are global pressures. One is just the rise of populist authoritarianism, the ideas of people who kind of challenge any sort of elite rhetoric or elite scientific knowledge and come in and say, hey, look at all this garbage that you've been handed. I'm going to come in and change things. These jokers at the top, if we get rid of them and you just listen to me, think things are going to be better, right? Again, we saw Donald Trump try to, sell that false promise in the United States, but he's not alone. We've seen, populist authoritarians be successful in many other parts of the world. I think South Africa has not yet, succumbed to a comparable populist authoritarian. Even Jacob Zuma, who was more of a populist, was, I think, more constrained by the polity. And some might say that Julius Malema, who is from a competing political party, offers a kind of populist alternative, but the South Africans haven't gone for him yet. So I think that, and then finally, I think that some of the problems of social media. Social media is great for sharing information. We all learn a lot about it. We promoted this event on social media, so we're glad that we got all these participants to join us. But the reality is a lot of misinformation and anger gets fueled and gets cooked at a very high heat very quickly in ways that aren't good for democratic politics. So all of these, it provides a difficult recipe for consolidating democracy.
And you did touch on some of what I'm about to ask you next, but what would you say for the world, for the United States, are the lessons here from South Africa? Sometimes I feel when I see things happening in American politics, I kind of want to shout, yeah, we've kind of been through this before, some of this, learn from South Africa, because we've been down this road. And for me, coming from South Africa, sometimes I think to myself, oh my goodness, I've already lived through this and here I am again. But what are the lessons about overcoming the racial divide? Not that we have completely overcome that, but the way we have gone through it, where we are now as South Africans, and this idea of that it's not just about winning your political freedom and having democracy, but preserving democracy. And as you write, the notion of abandoning liberal democratic government will continue to be a tempting option. What do you see in the world today that you think people can draw lessons from the South African experience?
I think there are a bunch of things. I think one important one is that democracy only works when we play by the rules. So in the United States at the moment, we're suffering with various attacks on just the legitimacy of our electoral system, the foundation of democracy, right? Donald Trump refused to accept that he lost the election. All of the institutions suggested that he had lost it, but he has perpetuated this and has a lot of followers who've come to believe him, and many are working to try to undermine, just the basic integrity of our electoral system. And when you have a divided society, unequal, different in culture, but trying to figure out a way to come together, you need a set of stable rules. And the thing that has impressed me about South Africa to date is that South Africans have played by the electoral rules. There has been 6 free and fair national elections, 6 free and fair local elections. The judiciary is largely respected. Even when the ANC had more than 2/3 of the seats in parliament, which gave them an opportunity to rewrite the constitution and do things to kind of really cement their power, for the most part, they didn't do it. And I'm not sure why, but I think that Mandela's the spirit of restraint, of fair play. I think that was transmitted more broadly. That's maybe a hopeful interpretation. But I think that is critical. And I fear that in the United States and many other places, people who don't get what they want are beginning to turn towards, let's just play by different rules because the rules aren't working. So I think that's one important lesson to date. I think a second one that has impressed me about South Africa was that built into the Constitution was, a really important appreciation for human dignity, and all the different ways in which people, particularly those at the bottom of the social and economic ladder, needed to be respected, to get fair and equal treatment before the law, to have, a basic lifestyle provided for them. And it's absolutely true that has not been universally successful to date, right? There are millions of South Africans who don't have housing, water, electricity, sewage, But since 1994, there have been incredible gains on all of those dimensions, right? I mean, part of the frustration today is that a minority of Black South Africans have seen progress. They've seen that millions of South Africans have gotten these things, but not everyone has. So what's described as a failure of service delivery to me is, an incomplete success, right? They haven't finished the work. It's been less than 30 years. People have good reason to be frustrated. But I think that focus on basic dignity and treating every human as if they're valued, in many ways, that's been lost in the United States. That's been lost in many of the advanced industrialized countries. I'm not saying that it's been fully embraced every day in South Africa, but as an outsider, I respect it. I see it in so many different institutions of the country and of government. And I think particularly for wealthier countries, it's something that we need to embrace to a greater degree.
Evan, this is fascinating. We have just a couple more minutes before we open up this platform for questions. Is there anything you want to share with us that you really hope people come away with when they read your book?
Well, first of all, unlike my first two books, I hope that they'll just enjoy reading it. I previously wrote very academic books, filled with analysis of statistics and data. And, for academic researchers, we're also storytellers. And I really want people to be able to understand how amazing South Africans are, what a beautiful country it is, the struggles that they face should give one insight about the struggles we face. And I think for a lot of it, I don't think I answered the question for you at the beginning, which was, who did I think the audience for this was? And, I'll be delighted if some South Africans read the book and appreciate it. And I really appreciate your saying that you did. But I think Americans are very insular. We don't know a lot about other parts of the world to the extent that we should, or we understand in a thin way. And for me, one of the great rewards in my life, and I'm grateful to my parents for always sharing with me the value of travel, seeing other places, is to make you think about possibilities and to think about what matters in the world. And so I hope that it just raises questions for people about how life can be, how life should be, and for all of us to think about this incredible idea of democracy. It's unique in world history, right? And for most of world history, life was brutish and short and anarchical. Another way of living is under tyranny. Democracy is this amazing opportunity for all of us to participate and to have agency and to try to create a shared better life. And so thinking about that, thinking about another context, I hope will contribute to a more thoughtful discussion of democracy in our country.
Well, I will tell you, I was reading your book and I was going through it and I was saying to myself, oh, thank you so much for talking about this, for writing about this, because some of these things are so important that I think as South Africans, because we're so preoccupied with what is happening in the country today, I think there are certain messages that only someone looking from the outside in and really taking that particular interest in the country can articulate to a wider audience. Not to say South Africans can't, but you just look at it through a different lens sometimes, right? And I've got a question here, and I'm so glad we have this question because it's something I had to skip some of my own questions. This idea of patience. And we've got a question here. It says, it seems like one of the underlying themes of the book is that Black South Africans have shown a certain amount of patience as progress is made, albeit slowly. Is it realistic to believe that Black South Africans will continue to show patience going forward as the country continues to face so many challenges?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's a good question, but it's a tough question because, it's hard for me to put myself in the shoes of someone who is living without a formal house, maybe in a very small house with cement walls, but walls that leak and doesn't have a reliable tap, whose children aren't able to find work and really need it. I don't think people should deserve to be patient in a world or in a country in which, the resources are there to live a better life. But I think so I don't think people need to be expected to be patient, in the sense, if patient means sit quietly and just wait for the government or someone else to deliver, right? That's unreasonable. But I think what we do see is for people to have some agency in their lives, to work in their communities and try and challenge government or challenge others to collectively create a better life, whether it's through entrepreneurialism, whether it's, digging water holes, whether it's building homes and trying to cooperate. And there are great examples throughout the country. I have lots of friends who are involved in a project called Asa Vilakani, in which, small civil society organizations work together. They challenge government when they're not delivering, but when they are, they build cooperatively. So I think it is to exert human agency to try to help build a better life.
We have another question here. It says, I'm thinking about shortcomings. Are we overlooking the impact of population growth? 30 million in 1993 to 62 million people today. And that has outstripped economic growth. Similar situation in at least DRC, Malawi, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that all countries, over the course of development have go through periods initially with high population growth rates, which eventually tend to slow down because of what seems to be a natural life cycle of the way countries operate. I haven't heard others, and I haven't thought about it myself as that being a fundamental problem that's unique to South Africa, because I think countries in general have dealt with population growth. I think population movement, both within South Africa and from north of the border, is particularly challenging, in that in the areas of relative success, which is for the most part the major cities, which are better governed, which have more resources, though as those services have been delivered, people from rural areas have moved in droves, and people from north of the Limpopo River have come down to South Africa, and that has created a lot of anti-migrant violence and resentment in the country. Again, from the perspective of people who are trying to make a life for themselves and their families, it's understandable why they move to places where they think they're going to have an opportunity. But it's like quicksand, in Mahali City as well, which in many ways, which I describe in the book, has had a lot of successes. No one in Mahali City would describe it as a successful municipality, but they've done a lot. They provided a bunch of housing and new schools and clinics and things like that. But every day they provide housing, there are many more people who come in search of housing. So it always looks, you're never going to solve the backlog from that. So it could be population growth, but I think it's also population movement.
And we've got another quick one here. Beyond the headlines, how has the South African government so far responded to the global challenges of COVID and climate change? And how have the people reacted to the government's response?
Yeah, great question. I had to write an afterword to my book because I finished it in the era of COVID, and to take a step back, many people who are on this Zoom webinar may remember that South Africa was notorious for its very poor handling of the AIDS pandemic. Right, there was a lot of pressure on that, and that's a long and challenging story. I think that in many ways, the South African government was impressive on COVID. It immediately took action. There was no denial that this was a threat. Those early stages, the fears, right, that people who were living cheek to jowl with a highly contagious, virulent, disease would just die in droves. I mean, it scared the daylights out of me. And, for the South African government, there was no denial. There was quick action. It was tough. There were a lot of police involved. I think a lot of actors in South African society said, hey, you are violating our civil rights. They're people who are poor, who need to be able to get out of their homes in order to, provide food and get water. And then there was an adjustment. And so there was a lot of criticism in the media of the South African response by South Africans. But again, watching from afar, what I saw was an aggressive government, an attempt to stop this thing in its tracks, and then an adjustment in order to deal with the realities of what we knew scientifically and what we knew on the ground. Now, climate change is a tough one for everybody, and the South Africans are really facing it, hard. They're one of the countries, a few countries in Africa which really has on its shoulders the fact that it's a serious carbon emitter with a big coal industry. So it's going to have to make the energy transition, and that's difficult because there are vested interests in not doing that. So there's been a lot of talk around trying to make the country more green, but I think that there's been insufficient action. But there's been attention to it. It's a start, but I don't think that we can say that South Africa is a climate leader. But I will say, as one anecdote kind of supporting the general thesis of the book, I was amazed back when Cape Town faced, almost the complete loss of water, right? The reservoir was about to go dry. They were talking about day zero. And, the city of Cape Town, one of the more effective governments in South Africa, owing to global warming, was losing water, and just worked very hard, not as authoritarian government, but really trying to work with society through some shaming, some blaming, some incentives, and drastically got society, for the city of Cape Town, to reduce water usage. They averted day zero. And, I just went back to South Africa for the first time in March since the end of COVID. And, everyone was saying, well, we've figured out ways to reduce our water usage. And, they're now, people, on average, Cape Townians, I believe, have reduced by 50% the amount of water they use. And some universities say, well, we built systems, now we're saving on electricity as well as water usage. And it was an absolutely impressive response. Again, it's very South African to not appreciate, people focus on what didn't go right. But it was, it was amazing. It was really amazing what was accomplished. And I think that is going to be a lesson to a lot of us. How do you figure out this challenge of the fact that all of us are consuming too much? We've got to, consume less in order to have the resources that all of us need.
You let so many of our secrets out about what South Africans are really like, but it's so true. I don't know if we still have time for a very last question. I was really hoping we could squeeze in more questions, but unfortunately we have to end things here. Evan, thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. It was enlightening, and I really enjoyed your book. I'm definitely going to get another copy and give to some friends, South African friends. And of course, that is then all we have time for today. Thank you so much again, Evan. It's really been a pleasure. Your new book, Until We Have Won Our Liberty, South Africa After Apartheid. It is available wherever books are sold, including your local independent bookstore. As attendees, of course, you will have received that 30% discount for purchasing the book directly from its publisher. And you can also find Evan on social media. Evan, if you just want to tell us how people can find you on social media.
I'm at Evlieb, E-V-L-I-E-B. I would love to engage you on Twitter.
Fantastic. And to learn more about World Affairs, head to their website, www.worldaffairs.org, where you can find their live streamed and in-person program and more information about their programs. Thanks to you, our audience, for taking your time to be with us. Thank you so much to everyone. Go well.